Hi everybody. I've been asked when I'm next going to publish something on YouTube. Well, Glossolalia, which is a posh word for speaking in tongues, is a subject I've been considering for some time, and I hope you'll find what I have to share helpful. Now, as this can be a controversial subject, I thought I should give some background for myself and the beginnings of my walk with God. There's so much I could say, but here I'm concentrating on Glossolalia, and this will be my focus. But I do want to acknowledge right at the very beginning that there is much more to walking with Jesus than just speaking in tongues. I was not brought up a Christian. In my late teens, I met some folk who were Christians and who spoke to me about Jesus, about his love for me, and his wanting to share my life with me through the power of the Holy Spirit. Their lives spoke of the love of God, forgiveness, and unconditional acceptance. And after due consideration, I asked Jesus to come into my life and to share my future with me. And he did. It was very real, and it changed my life. Several months later, as I started at university, I joined the Christian Union. Here I found the most diverse gathering of Christians that you could imagine. There were Anglicans, Catholics, Methodists, Plymouth Brethren, Pentecostal, House Church, just to name a few. Being young and observant, I quickly realised that not everybody knew Jesus quite like I did. Everybody knew about Jesus, but some really knew him in a personal way. This relationship did not seem to be related to denomination, and it was puzzling to me. All I knew was that I wanted to be more like the folk who walked with Jesus, and wondered how this could be. This was in the late 60s and early 70s, and the charismatic movement was sweeping through the churches, bringing joy to some and confusion to others. Being new to the church myself, I understood very little of this. However, I was reading my Bible. The Living Bible had just been published, so my aborted attempt to read through the King James Bible, which had ground to a halt somewhere in Leviticus, was revived with the advice from a friend to start again in the New Testament in the Living Bible. So I read through the Gospels, and surprisingly, I didn't seem to get very much out of it. However, I should say that since then I've read through the Gospels quite a number of times and found them awesome. Anyway, at that time, I began reading the Acts of the Apostles in my Bible readings. Also, my friends were speaking to me about the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And by the time I'd reached the end of the Acts, I was convinced that the baptism of the Spirit was real, and real for today. One evening, when we had returned from seeing The Cross and the Switchblade at the cinema, we prayed together for a while. Someone read from Isaiah 53, and that combined with knowing that Jesus could have called down 12 legions of angels if he had wanted to stop the crucifixion. This somehow opened me up to understanding more of God's love for me and for all of us, and everything became more real and certain. Some people have described their baptism in the Spirit as being filled with liquid love, and it was a bit like that for me. I didn't speak in tongues at this point. However, by their fruit you shall know them. I found my Bible readings became alive, and practically every line needed highlighting in some way. I had just started reading Romans. And then in the Christian Union, my usually quiet demeanour became more vocal as I began to pray out in the prayer meetings, much to the amusements of some of my friends who could tell what had happened just by looking at me. So, what about all this speaking in tongues stuff? Well, it had been mentioned, but I'd not really listened, as it all seemed really rather weird and unlikely. However, it was mentioned in Acts, and was usually linked with the baptism of the Spirit. But I did not do it yet. I was going to see a friend, and it was to be a very difficult meeting. And as I was walking there through a wooded area, I felt God draw close to me and say that he wanted me to pray in tongues for the meeting. I protested, "Lord, I don't know how to pray in tongues." And I felt him say, "Just speak the sounds I give you and believe that they are pleasing to me." I should say I didn't actually hear God audibly, but all the same I knew that he was speaking to me in my heart by his Spirit. I looked around. Was anybody else listening? This was going to sound very silly, but if it was pleasing to God, I'd give it a go. But how to start? Well, I've been reading Lord of the Rings, and in that book there's a lot of elvish language and of course a hero named Frodo. So I think probably my first words in tongues was something like Ferodo, followed by a staggering flow of what sounded to me like absolute gibberish. I suppose we all have to start somewhere. I felt nothing. I was in full control of what I was saying and when to speak and when to stop speaking. All in all, for me, it was more an act of obedience than anything else, and I was left with an overall feeling of rather silliness. However, I met with my friend, and we found both of us were able to say things that needed to be said, and things also that I believe changed the course of both our lives. And I've been able to speak in tongues ever since, whenever and wherever I want to. I can start and stop when I want to, and usually it feels rather matter of fact. However, if I ask to interpret what I've been saying, then I may get a wave of emotion as I realise how the Holy Spirit has been praying or worshipping through me. That was 50 years ago. So, what have I learned about speaking in tongues since then? Well, 1 Corinthians 14 seems to be the chapter about getting tongues and other spiritual gifts in perspective. It is important to get the gift of tongues in perspective, and I'm not trying here to put speaking in tongues before any other gift. It is just that here I am wanting to share with you what I've learned about speaking in tongues. Speaking in tongues can be used in your own personal life and also communally during the gatherings of the church, and I'm going to look at each of these separately. So, personally, speaking in tongues is the only gift given by God that we return directly to him. In 1 Corinthians 14 verse 2, Paul writes, "For if you have the ability to speak in tongues, you will be talking only to God." So all the other gifts are from God to man to man. Healing is from God to man, and man is healed. Likewise, all the other gifts, prophecy, words of knowledge and wisdom, discernment, etc., are all from God to man and spoken to man. Even deliverance is from God to man, and man is delivered. Speaking in tongues is the only gift from God to us that we then speak directly back to him. So I think that's thrilling. So when we come to consider the interpretation of tongues, it should be as worship, praise or prayer. In some churches it is traditional to interpret a tongue as prophecy, and whilst there is inherently nothing wrong with that, there is the gift of prophecy for prophecy. Next, speaking in tongues is for the edification of the self. In 1 Corinthians 14 verse 4, Paul writes, "A person who speaks in tongues is strengthened personally." Well, I don't know about you, but there are often times when I need to be personally strengthened and edified, and when I don't know how to pray for myself. Praying in tongues ticks these boxes. Paul says that he prays in tongues more than anyone else, and looking at his lifestyle and many life events, it seemed that he needed to be personally strengthened and edified a lot of his life. So how about speaking in tongues in the congregation? Well, in my experience, in a gathering, tongues is used in two different ways. Firstly, there is the time during worship when classically a person will pray out loud in tongues in such a way so that all can hear what is being said. In 1 Corinthians 14 verse 27, Paul says, "No more than 2 or 3 should speak in tongues. They must speak one at a time, and someone must interpret what they say." So the tongue may be followed by an interpretation, or maybe another tongue, or maybe a third tongue. And in an inexperienced or enthusiastic congregation, you may get a 4th tongue as well. Then someone may interpret all 3 tongues together, leaving a short pause between interpretation. Sometimes the interpreter only interprets one of the tongues, and may then say they have only that one interpretation. And another interpreter will interpret the other 2 tongues. Sometimes there's a long pause waiting for the interpretation. The meeting leader needs to manage this and may need to encourage a shy or reluctant interpreter to move in their gifting, or even interpret it himself or herself. As above, the interpretation is usually praise, worship or prayer, but grace should be extended as folk learn to move in these giftings. Also, those gifted with interpretation need to stir up their gifting so that when a person is speaking out in tongues, they are seeking God for the interpretation. It's not unusual for several people to have a similar interpretation, but only the first to speak up gets heard. And I've never heard of any interpreter contradicting the first, saying that they got it wrong. However, I have heard of occasions when a person in the congregation has actually recognised the language as, say, aristocratic German or Mandarin Chinese, or on one occasion I heard of a non-English speaking congregation where somebody spoke in tongues in English. Secondly, there is a time when the whole congregation may be worshipping together, and all may be speaking out at the same time, some in their own language and some in tongues. When I first heard this, I was a student attending an enthusiastic Pentecostal church for the first time. I was shocked by the volume of everybody speaking so loudly, and what I thought was chaos. However, after a few minutes, they began to sing in the Spirit, and I'll say a little bit more about this later. Anyway, I felt as though I'd been transported into a company of angels. My experience of other congregations since then has been a little more moderate, but just as worshipful. At times, when the congregation has been praying for a specific situation or person, they can be encouraged to all pray in tongues, so that God can pray through them. This is possible because praying in tongues is like speaking any language. You just decide when to start, and you speak and you stop. It's just that with tongues you may not understand what you're saying, unless of course you ask for an interpretation. Sometimes when there's been some current event on the news, or there may be someone in our congregation who needs prayer, after praying in English, I may encourage the whole congregation to pray at the same time, either in tongues or in English if they prefer, so that there is a buzz of prayer throughout the gathering. Somehow things always seem complete to me when we do this. So, singing in the Spirit. This, I think, is one of the wonders of worship. This is when folk in the congregation begin to sing together in tongues, harmonising to a tune given by God. Often this may begin after a worship song, as some folk begin to sing quietly in tongues, harmonising together, and then the whole gathering begins to sing together. Some folk may choose to sing in their own language. This is particularly useful in a multi-language congregation, so everybody can join in and sing praises to God. I've been in a gathering where there didn't seem to be any build-up to the singing, just bang, everybody singing in the Spirit at the top of their voices. It was incredibly powerful and beautiful, and even more remarkable as after a while the singing stopped as suddenly as it started. This congregation would often sing in the Spirit, often several times during a gathering, and they loved it, and they were very experienced at moving in the Spirit. In the church I was part of for a number of years, a large part of the congregation was made up of Farsi speakers, most of whom had very little English. Sometimes we would sing one or more of the simple choruses in English, and then we'd sing it in Farsi, and then in tongues or any language people wanted to sing in. We had quite a scattering of different languages in that congregation. Somehow singing together in those many languages and allowing the Spirit to add some extra harmonies was always most beautiful and very exciting. This is a good way to introduce a congregation to singing in the Spirit. Choose a simple one-line chorus, sing it in English a couple of times, and then encourage those who can speak or sing in tongues to do so, whilst others continue to sing in English. Sometimes you'll find some of the English speakers begin to join in tongues. It's worth noting here that if you have an enthusiastic music group and a good PA system, that they should be as quiet as possible, as it's so important to be able to hear the congregation sing. A gentle lead from a keyboard or guitar is plenty for this. Earlier on I said that interpretation of tongues should be thought of as worship and not necessarily prophecy. So I thought I'd say a little bit more about how God gives us a word and then allows us to share it how we feel is appropriate at the time. So, for example, if during worship I feel God's love bubbling in my spirit, I can then choose how or if to share it with the congregation. So in prayer it might come out as, "Thank you God for your love for us," etc. Or in prophecy, the Lord is saying to us that he loves us. Or as a word of knowledge, there is someone here who needs to know God's love for them. Or even as a wisdom picture, I can see a warm sunny day and I feel God is saying that he loves us. So, if that word comes as someone is speaking in tongues, then the interpretation may be based around it. Lord, your love for us is so amazing. We worship you. So, those are some of my thoughts on speaking in tongues, or the posh word glossolalia. And I hope that as you've listened, so God's spoken to you and you found some of my thoughts and comments helpful, and also my experience in this. God bless you.